Hi, everyone. Good afternoon. If you've come to the right place, it's the Denise show this afternoon. Are there any other Denises in the audience? No, because I know, it's very seldom that I'm ever in anything with another Denise, so this is awesome. My name is Denise Kufajanakis. I'm Associate University Librarian at the University of Alberta. I'm responsible for collections, bibliographic services, and access services. And with me today is Denise Pan, who is the Associate Dean for Collections and Content. And so basically today we're going to talk about budgeting within, in terms of going about simplifying your collections budget, what we've done at the University of Alberta and the University of Washington. And yeah, I'm going to start. Okay, so a common approach in collections budget management is to distribute allocations via format and subject area, as I'm sure you're all aware. Tracking acquisitions at a very granular level provides a very detailed level of information, of course, but it also results in a large number of funds to manage, often. And at the same time, we've been seeing a shift from individual title selection for monographs and serials to the packaging of resources, whether that be in big deals, resources that are multidisciplinary in nature, or consortial groupings of resources. So that's more the environment that we're currently working in. And so this leads to a misalignment between the resources we buy and the fund structure. And as a result, we do many workarounds, such as things like splitting funds, creating new funds, moving money between funds all the time, right? Trying to fit the current situation into the budgets that we have had over the years, or that fund structure. So we're going to talk about, as I mentioned, our approaches to trying to handle this situation differently by revising budget structures so that they function more simply and hopefully reduce some of the workload that comes along with budget management. So I'm from the University of Alberta Libraries, and I just wanted to give you a little bit of information about our institution in case you're not aware. We are, first of all, located in Edmonton, Alberta, Canada, and we can have about 38,000 students and 15,000 employees, over 18 faculties, and on 5 campuses. We have 500 graduate programs, so we're a large ARL institution. We're the second largest academic research library in Canada, holding just over 8 million volumes and 5.3 million titles. We have 10 locations for library collections, and our budget for collections is $25 million. A note that you should be aware of in the context of my talk, although I can't go into it in much detail, and in fact, there was another presentation this morning that unfortunately I missed due to some troubles with flights, that talked about this a little bit more. But in 2014, we at the University of Alberta Libraries completely stopped title by title selection for monographs, and we do no selection at all, in fact, and we have no selectors. So that is a big change that has to factor into what I'm going to talk about for our university. And then 2 years later, in 2016, we completely centralized all collections work. So that would be collection management, development, and acquisitions included there in one central unit. So it was back in 2012 that we began to look at reducing fund codes. And at that time, it's probably very hard to see. It looks very light, but you don't need to know the detail. I just want to give you a sense. So what's on the page here is about, a quarter of what our humanities and social sciences library had at the time for fund codes. So many, many fund codes. In total, in 2012, we had 736. We're talking about the base fund codes, base budget, no endowments included here, or anything like that. So it was huge. Not all of these were actually active, but they were still hanging around just in case. So there were 427 active codes, and only at the time that we started to change anyway payments against 292 of those codes in that year. So, which is still a lot. So why did we then care or want to go about making this change? First of all, there was a directive from our chief librarian at the time. We actually had a new senior financial officer come in who oversees the libraries and our broader portfolio called Learning Services. And, he really looked at things with fresh eyes and said, this is out of control, and it's time to perhaps narrow down the number of these codes. So we also noticed things like mistakes being made because invoices might have multiple fund codes against them, or the coding was being done line by line on particular invoices, those kinds of things. So this became very complex for the financial services staff and our acquisition staff to manage. So between those two groups, which both handle the authorization of the payment and the actual payment, it just meant that mistakes were being made as well that then we had to go back and fix. As I mentioned, some of the codes were not used at all in any case, and we did see this kind of splitting of funds for single products because they might be interdisciplinary, and health sciences would say, well, we'll throw in $10,000 if you throw in $20,000 science library, and together, or sometimes there might be 5 different libraries all going in together, and we'd be doing this kind of craziness and then maybe moving it centrally and into a different pot later. So all of this was starting to be a little bit out of control. So just a little bit on the process of change that we went through. I was in a different position before as collections coordinator, which was a centralized position, but really we were a very decentralized library when it came to collections at the time. So all of our locations had someone in a position like a collections manager who would manage that library's budget. So I went and reviewed with each of the libraries what it currently looked like and pointed out things like, well, you don't even use these codes, but also, well, just trying to work through it with them in terms of where can we reduce, like where is there overlap, or do we really need to be that granular to try to get it down? So trying to explain why this would be a good thing and just taking some slow steps. There was certainly some resistance to minimize the numbers of codes because they were set up, like people had reasons for why they wanted them to be set up in the first place, of course. And so it was trying to then look at it in a new way. So that year, after we looked at everything, we then were able to reduce down to 200 active monograph fund codes. So I'm just talking about monographs right now, but really it was all mirrored on the serial side as well, same high numbers of codes. And then we just, the following year, continued to work on chipping away at it and continuing to see if we could do further reduction. The other thing, I mentioned to you that in 2014, we stopped doing individual selection work, and that coincided with an RFP for an English language monograph preferred supplier. And so at that time, we took advantage of those things all coming together and were able to then further reduce the codes, and that got us down to 43. So I'll just show you what that looked like. So this is one of our fund reports. So before you saw it was just one library, and that was only a quarter of the codes that they had. So that same library basically got it down to about 15 codes after all of this kind of change. That's our biggest library who buys the most books, humanities and social sciences. But for everyone else, they had 2 at this point. So that was our reasoning. You can have 1 code for if it's coming on approval and 1 if it's a firm order. And everyone across the board had that. Plus, we had a few things centrally, like for our demand-driven acquisition program and things like that. So this particular structure worked for about 3 years. And then, as I noted, we formed this new collection strategies unit in April 2016. So this was the centralization of all collections work. So we no longer had, in addition to not having selection, we didn't have any budgets being assigned to any of our subject libraries at all. Although in that very first year of the restructuring, we did keep the same budget in place. So we just kept purchasing things in the same way depending upon the location of the libraries. But during that time, it really didn't make sense because our new unit was really meant to focus holistically on the collection and not to have to worry about, where and how much exactly the spending was in each of the subject areas. So we kept the structure, but we kind of ignored it, and we just let things fall out where they were in that first year. But then since April 2017, what we did was completely change things so that we only have 2 fund codes for the whole of the materials part of the collections budget. So in total, there's 5 because in our collections budget, we also pay for some outsourced cataloging, digitization, and there's some of the non-acquisition types of expenditures. So those 3 are separate, but the 2 up at the top, the CSU 02 and the CSU 90, those are our 2 main fund codes that we use now. So one is just for ongoing expenditures, and the other is for one-time. That's the way that we decided to treat it or differentiate because it determines how we track it internally and the processes that need to happen. I'll just mention as an aside, we also do not use our ILS for acquisitions, so we do everything actually in our financial systems, PeopleSoft, and this goes very well with that kind of a system. I will note at the right-hand side on the account code there, those do allow us to code material by material type. So it's very simple. We probably have 6 of these. So we do code though for like print book, ebook, rare book, those kinds of things. So finally, we have to have such a very quick overview, unfortunately. But what this change has meant for us in getting it down to just the 2 codes is really the simplicity. It's a much, much more simple structure, and that's meant a lot less complexity for staff. It's given us a lot greater flexibility. Our librarian team in our new centralized unit consists of a manager who reports to me and 4 librarians who take care of all the work that needs to be done in relation to collections. And we also have 2 support staff teams. But in any case, the librarians are meant to be working together as a team and looking at the whole of the collection across all subject areas, talk about things and figure out what is needed, where do we need to place our resources. So they do that. It gives them flexibility because what would have happened in the past would have been, of all the collection managers in the different libraries, there would have been a little bit more of a trying to hold on to what was then in that particular budget, or selectors oftentimes wouldn't spend out their money, but then they'd be kind of being forced to, and there might not even be things that they needed to spend it on. And we'd have other areas where we couldn't buy some resources that we really should have and needed. So now that takes all that away for us, and we can focus on what are the needs and go ahead then and address any concerns and add to our collection. So it gives us that greater responsiveness as needs arise. And, you know, I put less territorial approach because we aren't then fighting over any pots of money. And it's become our mantra to just focus on what is the need. Are we meeting the needs of the faculty and students and the whole of our university community? And as long as we're doing that, then we're okay. And so we try never to talk about with faculty or anyone in terms of dollars. It's more about, so it's not about how much something might cost, it's about the resources that they need to do their research or their study. And that's what we try to go forward with. So I'm just going to also note that the process of change that we had with these other pieces also happening really allowed us to go ahead with this model, because I don't think that if we still had like 60 librarian selectors as we did in the past, we would be able to just have the one big pot. Maybe you could, and maybe some others of you have done that, but I think it would have been probably a lot of challenge to juggle and work that out. So yeah, some of the things that we were doing already in terms of structure has really helped then influence how we can go about management of the budget. Okay, and I'll turn it over to Denise for Washington's take.
This is the problem with being a little short. It's like where I can see the audience over and my monitor and all of you, so I kind of can't see, but hopefully you can kind of see the top of my head. So a little context for the University of Washington. It's one library serving 3 campuses. We're ranked in the top 10 of U.S. public libraries according to Association Research Libraries. We serve 50,000 students, full-time students, over 12,000 graduate students, and grant PhDs in 116 fields. The library collection expenditures average about 16 million, and we operate 16 physical library locations and have 350 employees. We allocate to 70 different subject areas and work with around 50 subject librarians. So it's interesting, Denise and I, with the same name, but very different institutions of, I was thinking when Denise was speaking, she was very much like a cooking show, and she's showing you the after, the lovely consolidation of simplifying a budget. And I'm talking about how you start that process, the beginning, and a little bit of a recipe of hopefully we'll have this beautiful cake at the end of this process, but we're not quite there. So I'm just giving you sort of the first preliminary. So I've been in my role, in my position since, maybe I'll just close this and look at that screen. Since June 2016, we initiated this multi-year process in the fall of 2017. So we're basically a year into this process of reducing the number of funds for ongoing serial costs. So like many libraries, and if you were part of the session that I was in before, many libraries across the US and Canada are going through this change and talking about how can we simplify our budget and budget allocation process. So this is nothing new or unique. We continue to experience staff retirements, resignations, and we are recruiting new staff. I'm 2 years into my role. Our students and faculty are demanding new resources, and we have limited funding and staff support. There's strong interest, there's so much interest of doing greater good with our libraries and our collections, but how do we actually make those changes? The existing budget structure to me was very clear that that was sort of impeding us from doing the things we wanted to do and seizing opportunities that exist. So our fund structure and sort of the allocation practice remained fundamentally unchanged for 20 years. And off the top allocations for ongoing and serial costs based on negotiated prices, market usage estimates for packages, ILL cataloging, and other associated acquisitions, access to discovery expenses, everything taken off the top. remaining allocations to monograph approvals and firms based on historical amounts and percentages going back 20 years. And then funding for new formats and initiatives were a completely ad hoc process when there's money available. And when is there money available? So subject lines with historically small allocations, it was incredibly difficult for them to order new databases or journals, no matter how relatively inexpensive, because they had to draw upon their monograph allocations to start that new print or electronic subscriptions. The end result is that our fund structure and allocation practices limited our ability to be responsive to user needs. So leading the transformation, when I arrived, I sat down and talked with our subject librarians in groups and one-on-one meetings, whoever really wanted to talk to me, and I reached out to them as well. And these conversations and past practices and really talking about things that had happened at different, especially down cycles, when there was rescissions or recessions, talking about what had happened and how those cancellations were taken, managed at those previous times. And it was clear that this was, it was not an easy and it's never easy to do a cancellation, but these things, how it was conveyed to me, it struck on a very personal and emotional chord. And so they were at the point of realization that they wanted to make changes, that we weren't doing things the way we wanted to. We weren't serving our users with our collections the way they wanted to. And it almost seemed like I was something out of, what do you call, Oliver, or one of the, More Please, where they were asking me as a new AD that we're hoping for you to bring us more money. And I kept thinking, no, I did not bring a suitcase of cash with me from my previous institution. There is no more money. We have the money we have. We need to talk about how we're going to allocate and spend that money. So what is that process and what is the change? So I drew upon John P. Kotter's 8 steps to providing strategic leadership, encouraging culture change, and albeit in a slightly modified order. So I'm going to be talking about over the 2-year process. This has taken me since when I started, basically June of 2016, to understand the landscape and start moving in towards leading change through Kotter's 8 steps. So the first step is, because we work in libraries, is to convene a committee. So my first step is actually the second of Kotter's, is I called it the CPR, Communication Process Review Committee. Because we needed to bring new life into our collection development. People got the joke. And in September 2016, the charge of the committee is to review the strengths, weaknesses, and effectiveness of communication channels and decision-making processes. And to establish a sense of urgency, I presented to our libraries cabinet, which is all the administrators, the other ADs, as well as to our Collections Council, this resources budget reflection 10-year forecast. And I did that in November 2016. And I described the worst case scenario. I like to call these the Chicken Little scenarios, when the sky is truly falling. So I said, what is the dire consequences if we continue at this path that we're living on right now? If our expenditure patterns, and what if we have 5 flat budgets over a period of time? What is that world going to look like? How could we live with this being our reality unless we make a change? So that is really a way of explaining the situation in a very real scenario, and then talking about at that point of, this is where we're going. Let's not go there. Let's talk about where we want to go. What is our vision? Sharing future sustainability strategy and potential next steps, and all in the same slide deck. So in March of that year, the CPR committee, they went out and talked to people, they came back and they made recommendations on a more effective and efficient organizational structure that could be basically the foundation of a powerful guiding coalition that would support collections resources central to the libraries. Since many of those recommendations, because we're talking about a liaison model, a subject with 70 funds, but 50 different people, a reporting lines through 3 different ADs, 2 other ADs besides myself, and some of my technical services and collection development librarians were subject librarians. So this was beyond my purview. So I shared a memo. It's also what we do in academia. We write memos to reiterate the sense of urgency that we are faced with significant challenges, limited state appropriations, flat or reduced university funding, and unsustainable publisher prices. Everyone knows, but somehow putting it in a memo that I could draw upon and bring up at various moments in time to reiterate what are we going to do from here, and communicated the vision. What is the vision? We have been really good stewards of university resources, and now we need to be strategic stewards. I believe we can ensure success by recognizing that collection development is a collective process. Individual decisions have a cumulative effect, and imagined collaboration and communication among all participants can produce more strategic directions. So it's not about your department, your funding, your pot of money to buy books or databases of whatever, but what are we building as a collection, as a unified group for the University of Washington? So on to more steps. So I was able to convene the Collections and Resources Council in July of 2017, and I enabled them to empower others to act on the vision. The group is co-chaired by myself and the Director of Collection Analysis and Strategy, and intended to be the primary body for investigation, discussion, and decision-making on issues related to the library's collections and budgets. So with the CRC established, we could proceed with planning for and creating short-term wins and consolidating improvements and still producing more changes. From there, again, I convened another committee. This one was called the Environmental Scan Task Group. And this group was convened in November of 2017 with a charge to establish baseline data and sustaining and transforming our collection development practices. So they were asked to find some examples, not make a decision, not necessarily make a recommendation, but really I wanted them to make a recommendation. But they were not recommending recommendations. They're just telling us what are the possibilities. Okay, so with that, they provided lots of example allocation models. They conducted a literature review. They surveyed budget allocation practices of peer institutions, and recommended short and long-term actions. And so to facilitate this process, we were able to hire a consultant, to have someone external to the library to come in and talk to about us. What are we doing? To explain to someone who doesn't work there and use language. It was a really important process to really reflect on what are our assumptions that we're making when we're making these allocation and what we're doing and talking about what is the work that we're doing and how, at the end of the day, my question always is how does this help our users? How does this help our students? If it doesn't help them, maybe it's something we shouldn't be doing. So having a consultant to be part of that process, to ask those questions, to convene those conversations, and to write a report to kind of consolidate and contextualize the recommendation. So from there, the consultant presented a report, and then it was discussed at that Collections Resource Council. We discussed it. They had time to reflect on it. The following meeting was in May. We decided we're going to take some of the recommendations and move forward. So, and then we could start with this in the fall of, start of the FY 18-19. So we just started implementing just this July. So what did we actually end up deciding to do? In the first year, we were reducing the number of funds of ongoing serial costs at the fund group level. So we have 2 serial lines established for each affected fund group, the one for database-like subscriptions and one for journals, both print and online. The separate fund lines will simplify the inflation calculation during the allocation process. Now, this is most evident for our cancellations and cessations because previously those credits were returned to the monograph fund for the individual subject fund, so chemistry. So what happened on the acquisition side, they had to track every single dollar that if monograph money was used to pay for a new journal that was part of a package, they had to track that in the package. And then, so if that title moved, they had to track the movement of that title and that dollar, whatever size that was, from one package to another package. So it created all these shadow systems and crazy spreadsheets. And you talk about retirements and resignation, the person who did this work retired. Who's going to do the spreadsheet? Who's going to be able to track these tiny little bits and bytes of dollars from monographs to serials to package back and back to refund? So much time and effort. It ended up to maintain this, hiring 2 different acquisitions, doing it at part-time to kind of disperse the work over 2 different acquisition staff members. And so we can't continue doing this. So this change was eliminating, we called it this, the person, we named it after the person who retired, his spreadsheet. When he retired, we need to retire this practice. So now we don't do that anymore. Now the refunds are going back to at least the fund group level. So we're tracking back at a more consolidated, so no longer back to the fund, so it's no longer chemistry, engineering, and math, it's going to sciences. And then sciences as a group is talking about what do we want to do with this money that we're getting. So we still have the historical practice of allocating within the funds for monograph, whatever that historical allocation back to those subject areas still exists. But this was sort of a win for us in terms of moving towards consolidation and making a collective decision. So, so for now, we are focusing on fund groups that have more similar, the ones that have more similar acquisition practices. And we are developing a desiderata database to really talk about things that people really want to be doing that we can't be doing now. So to have sort of that brass ring of what are the collections, how should we be building our collection together. So we have consensus and buy-in to start in making changes. We have started an understanding of problems and potential solutions. And in the first year, we've achieved consensus on implementing those recommendations. While the change might not sound particularly bold or dramatic, it is a shift from individual management to collaborative decision-making. And we've continuously reiterated and reinforced this is a multi-year process. We just started with arts and sciences and humanities, but we're going to be working towards our other subject areas. We collect in vernacular and language. We have Chinese, Japanese, Koreans, international studies, special collections. They're going to be brought into the fold as well. So I leave you with this last little quote or a couple sentences from John P. Kotter. He says, "There are still more mistakes that people make, but these 8 are the big ones. I realize that in a short article, or in my case, a short presentation, everything is made to sound a bit too simplistic. In reality, even successful change efforts are messy and full of surprises. But just as a relatively simple vision is needed to guide people through a major change, so a vision of the change process can reduce the error rate, and fewer errors can spell the difference between success and failure." So thank you. So, questions? Okay, just 5 minutes for questions. Oh, actually, we could go longer, but he came back. Yeah, we were preemptively told that we needed a vacate, but we actually have. Yeah.
Great presentation. I'm from the University of Michigan, and it sounds like a dream because we're one of those places that has a lot of budgets. A lot of this change that you brought forth came from the top down. How would you suggest any kind of change coming from the bottom up?
I actually turned it around to them. So when I talked about the subject librarians really they wanted things and saying, more, please. I was like, yes, well, sorry, I don't have more money, but we can talk about making changes. And the director of collection analysis and strategy, who would always like respond back when they would say like, well, we want to do this. And it's like, yeah, we could do that. We can do whatever you want, but there's consequences. So yes, we could give more money to this or that, but then we're going to have to do something because we only have the pot that we have. So talking about trying to get people to be thinking beyond their sort of their own department and talk about the university as a whole. We are sort of the biggest institution in the state of Washington and more or less the Pacific Northwest. So it's like we have a responsibility to the public. And so are we doing what we're doing? Is that fulfilling our responsibility? So I would often sort of turn it around in them and talk about it and give them they get to make those decisions about this book or that book, but then when they start talking about, well, why can't I buy this? And it's like, well, okay, well, let's talk about changing the structure. And so having that simple vision of like, I really want us to have collections that serve our entire population, 50,000 students across 3 campuses. How do we make that happen? So I don't know.
I'll just add that what we did, some of it was top down. Our initial, in terms of even like on the monograph purchasing and stopping selection, yeah, that was a decision between myself and the chief librarian, to tell you the truth. And I learned a lot of lessons from that because it was very, very hard. So that was the hardest part of it, was that beginning. Which people came around to. And some people actually right from the start were quite happy with that change because they didn't want to do that kind of work anyway, because there were all these other growing areas that as liaisons they want to be able to participate in. They don't care about, spending their however many $1,000s on books. So, but what we did after that was we put together a working group. And at our institution anyway, those are pretty well regarded. A working group takes somewhere between 6 months and a year to actively and in-depth look at a particular issue. In this case, it was our collection structure on the whole. And the report came back, approved by our senior team, and then all the rest was quite easy. And that led to the change of the centralizing of the whole function. And so within that, when this budget change or the fund code structure change was made to really just have ongoing and one time, there was not a peep from anybody. The only question that ever really arises is when it comes to some bits on reporting for professional schools. That's the only thing. So it's actually been pretty smooth sailing.
Thank you.
That reporting is actually what I wanted to ask about. I've been in conversations with my boss about simplifying our fund structure, but one of the obstacles we have is that we regularly have to produce reports of what the library has purchased to support all the academic programs, and those are on a regular cycle. So how do you approach those reports?
I would say that in the old model, we could not do that anyway. Because of the big deals, the packages, whatever we're buying that was interdisciplinary, you couldn't do it. So we were kind of doing it, but we were wrong. All the information we were providing was wrong because it was what was left in a particular subject area. And in fact, that was so skewed. So law, which has less of the big deals,
Right.
had more still in the traditional model of allocation. Health sciences hardly had anything. It looked like we weren't spending any money on our health sciences library because so much of it had come centrally into big packages and things like that. So, So that was kind of how I always, and it still is today, because we still get some questions. So there's some things through reporting that we can still get at, of course. We can pull out by subject areas and things like that. But really it has been reduced because we say that's not the way that we should or can even think about it anymore. And even under the old model, it didn't work.
Hi, my name's Michelle McClure, and I'm from University of Florida, and I'm a budget coordinator. And when you guys say that your budget is flat, does that mean, so it's kind of a two-part question. If your budget is flat, did it have room for inflation on your continuations? And if it does not, then how does your library address financing or funding the continuing resources when you aren't given the inflationary funding? Do you do it through cancellations, or are you even faced with that?
Okay. So, yeah, our budget this year is flat, has been flat. And so I would say that, again, having this model of just looking at the budget as a whole allows us then to work much better with that. So, you know, I have to say, I'm from a Canadian institution, and in Canada, the bigger factor than inflation is actually the US dollar, because we buy most of our materials in US dollars. And so when our Canadian, or the issue is the Canadian dollar against the US dollar, when that goes wrong for us, it has a dramatic effect. So we've been trying to come up with ways to manage that. So we've started to hold over where we may have money. We're being allowed to carry over and things like that. So that has helped us. It's a short-term Band-Aid solution, so to speak, but it does help. Otherwise, though, yes, we would look at cancellations. We're trying to think about cancellations not in terms of like, ooh, we need to do a big cancellation project because we've got $1 million cut this year or something like that, which we had done in the past. So instead, we're trying to think again about like, how are we in this hole meeting the needs or not, right? And so so if we don't, like Denise said, we have the money that you have, and that's what you've got to work with, right? So going back to those basics. So are there things, regardless if we didn't have a cut, that we should be canceling because they're no longer relevant? So trying to think about it from that approach, especially when there's new resources that do need to be picked up, even if you've got a cut. So we've got to make room for this new product that's really, really important, for example. So how do we then fit that in? So yeah, and that goes back to trying to put some strategy around it in terms of what the overall university needs are. I'm not going to say it's easy. It's not, right? Like, you're making choices, of course, but that we're just trying to change our thinking a little bit about it.
And I'll say some of the work that I was doing, I fortunately came in during a sort of an uptick where we had been, I've only been there at UW since June of 2016. So we have received increases during this time period. But prior to my arrival, there was a flat budget, there was a decrease, and people were incredibly traumatized by that. So how the flat budget, or perhaps even less than that, they took a 5% cut across all subject areas. And so depending on how big your allocation was to start, that dollar-wise and that impact of it was incredibly painful. So I spent a lot of time talking to the humanities and the social sciences and children's literature, who had a very small budget to start with. And so when the cuts happened, it was even deeper to the bone, where some people, it was a flesh wound, and others, it was so painful. And they had been more or less digging out from this and healing of getting their budgets back over subsequent years. And so I live in a state in the US that does not collect income tax. We have our state revenues from sales tax. It's a very volatile So in our state support, our president just talked about in sort of the annual report about state funding and where is University of Washington? We're getting these high rankings, but we don't have the state support to fund ourselves at this level, that we're much lower than our peers. So I've been through this mantra. I was like, I understand how budgets and state allocations work, and the writing on the wall, I know you guys are all traumatized, but we live in a state in the West where there's cyclical cycles, and we cannot assume. And we're amongst every other academic library or any library buying published materials. It is unsustainable, these price structures. So we are negotiating the deal, and there was a joke in the keynote this morning about where's the deal. We cannot continue to work in this environment. So I've been talking a lot about the review. This isn't like a cancellation. We should be looking and making sure we're buying the best and subscribing to the best resources that can serve our patrons within the budget that we have. And we should be working with our advancement. We have a very strong advancement team. We've been very fortunate. For Paul Allen, he recently passed away, founder of Microsoft. In endowments, we've worked very hard to be cultivating donors in the community to supplement our funding. But we really, I've been talking about the strategic, because those grant monies are restricted funding. So, and talking with the subject librarians about telling your story and what is your needs and articulating that so our advancement team can do their jobs to help us bring in more revenues to support our collections and our students. So thinking about whatever we have, are we making the best decision? There's no bad decision. Every decision is going to be a good one, but are we being strategic on why we're making this choice or that? So those are the sort of the approaches we're making, because I know that at some point we're going to have a flat, which is going to be a cut. But we need to be thinking about this as an ongoing process rather than, chop, you're going to just, the knee-jerk reaction of having to cut a bunch of money all of a sudden, versus we have more money so we can do more strategic things because we've got this ongoing desiderata list going. So we can buy more things off that list versus thinking the other way. So trying to look at it of we're doing the best we can with the resources we have.
Okay, thank you.
John Blosser from Northwestern. You both talked about groups who are reviewing and making decisions about what to collect or maybe what to get rid of. What's the practicality of how they work? Do they meet often? How long does it take to get an approval or a denial?
Oh, well, with us, it is what we call the collection strategies unit. And so there's 4 librarians plus a senior manager. They do that work together as a team and make the decisions. So they're not having to go upward for any approvals. That's their job. They do consult with the liaisons and get that feedback. And we're always asking liaisons to give us proactive feedback as well in terms of needs. So there is that back and forth as well.
Mine's just, we have that collection resources councils, and we have the fund groups. We have like 8 different fund groups, and those people sort of consolidate from the subject librarians, and then we bring them together. And we meet with them monthly, as well as lots of emails when there's a deal that needs to be decided upon.
Okay, thanks.
Oh, we should probably cut. Thank you all for coming.